The Alpha King hadn't smiled in 10 years. Then his wolf lost control the moment she laughed. For 10 years, no one in the northern packs had seen Alpha King Kael Ashgrove smile. Not once. Not at festivals, not at victories, not even when his own sister gave birth to her first pup. People said his face had simply forgotten how. They said his wolf had gone silent the night his mate died, and that the silence had never lifted since. Kael ruled with precision instead of warmth. He signed treaties without ceremony, settled disputes without raising his voice, and walked through his citadel like a man carrying something heavy that no one else could see. His guards respected him, his council feared him a little, and everyone, without exception, gave him space. That was simply how things were done in Ashgrove territory. Wren Calloway did not know any of this when she arrived. She was a healer from one of the smaller border packs, sent north because an illness had spread among the citadel guards, and the local healers needed extra hands. She came with a satchel of herbs, a stubborn streak a mile wide, and absolutely no patience for nonsense, royal or otherwise. On her first morning, she nearly walked straight into the Alpha King in a narrow corridor near the infirmary. She didn't recognize him. He wore no crown, no obvious markings of rank, just a plain dark coat and an expression so unreadable it might as well have been carved from stone. "You're blocking the only hallway wide enough to carry a stretcher," she said, stepping around him without waiting for a response. "Might want to stand somewhere else next time." He blinked. No one spoke to him that way. Not anymore. "I was told this corridor leads to the West Tower," he said evenly. "It does, after you let people through." She didn't even look back as she said it, already moving toward a coughing guard 2 doors down. Kael stood there a moment longer than he meant to, oddly unsettled by how little she seemed to care who he was. He found out an hour later, when his second-in-command, Wren, mentioned offhand that the new healer had scolded some broody stranger in the hallway. Wren went pale when Kael told him who the stranger had been. Kael, strangely, did not seem angry about it at all. Over the following days, their paths crossed more than either expected. The infirmary sat close to the council hall, and Kael found reasons to walk past it more often than necessary. He told himself it was because of the outbreak, because as Alpha King, he needed to monitor his guard's recovery. That was not really why. Wren, for her part, treated him exactly the same as she treated everyone else. She didn't flatter him. She didn't tiptoe. When he stood too close while she was trying to mix a tincture, she nudged him aside with her elbow like he was just another body in her way. "You know," she said one afternoon, measuring dried yarrow into a bowl, "for someone who supposedly runs an entire territory, you spend a lot of time hovering in doorways." "I am not hovering. You're hovering." She glanced up, amusement flickering in her eyes. "It's fine. Hover all you like. Just don't breathe on my herbs." He almost smiled then. Almost. It had been so long since the muscles in his face remembered the shape of it that even the attempt felt foreign, like trying to speak a language he'd once known and mostly forgotten. Wren noticed the almost. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. The guards under her care began to recover steadily, and as the days passed, the citadel settled into an easier rhythm. Wren stayed on a little longer than strictly necessary, partly because 2 patients still needed monitoring, and partly, though she wouldn't have admitted it aloud, because she'd grown curious about the quiet, watchful king who kept finding reasons to be near her. One evening, chaos broke out in the infirmary in the most undignified way possible. A young Omega named Pell, recovering well but still clumsy on his feet, knocked over a cart loaded with bottles, bandages, and a particularly unstable stack of folded linens. The cart toppled with a crash, bottles rolled in every direction, and Pell yelped and tried to catch everything at once, succeeding only in stepping on a roll of bandage that unspooled itself around his ankle like a trap. He stumbled, flailed, and sat down hard in a basket of folded cloths, looking utterly bewildered by how quickly his dignity had left the room. Wren, who had been mid-sentence explaining dosage instructions to Kael, not 3 feet away, burst out laughing. It wasn't a polite, restrained laugh. It was real, loud, unguarded, the kind of laugh that came from somewhere deep and honest, the kind a person couldn't fake even if they tried. She doubled over slightly, one hand braced on the table, the other pressed to her mouth as if that might somehow contain it. Kael felt something inside his chest crack open. It happened so fast he had no time to brace for it. His wolf, which had been silent and folded in on itself for 10 long years, surged forward with a force that knocked the breath out of him. For a decade, the wolf had refused to respond to almost anything. Not joy, not anger, not even grief. Not after the first unbearable months. It had simply gone still, like something that had closed its eyes and decided not to open them again. Now it clawed toward the surface so violently that Kael's control, usually absolute, slipped entirely. His eyes flashed gold. Not the brief, manageable flicker that disciplined wolves sometimes showed. A full, unmistakable shift in his gaze, sharp and bright, visible to everyone in the room. Pell froze mid-tangle in his bandages. 2 other guards went still. Bryn, who had just walked in, stopped so abruptly he nearly tripped over his own feet. An alpha king losing control, even for a heartbeat, was not something any of them had ever witnessed. Some of the younger guards had assumed his wolf was simply weak, or worse, gone entirely. Seeing it surge so suddenly, so visibly, was like watching a locked door blow open from the inside. Wren's laughter faded as she noticed the sudden silence around her. She looked at Kael, and saw his eyes, gold and startled, and entirely too alive for a man who supposedly hadn't smiled in 10 years. "Are you all right?" she asked carefully. Kael said nothing. He turned and left the room without a word, his pace controlled but unmistakably hurried, like a man trying to outwalk something chasing him from the inside. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in his private study with the fire burned down to embers, turning the moment over and over in his mind. 10 years. 10 years his wolf had stayed silent, refusing even the smallest flickers of feeling, as if mourning forever was the only loyalty left to give. And then a healer's laugh, unplanned and unremarkable to anyone else, had cracked that silence in an instant. It terrified him more than he wanted to admit. His mate Sarah had died on the night they were meant to fully bond, taken from him before they'd even had the chance to build a life together. In the years since, he had told himself, and everyone around him, that his wolf's silence was simply the cost of that loss, something permanent, something owed. To feel anything now, especially something as light and unguarded as this, felt like a betrayal of a promise he hadn't realized he'd made. So he did what he always did when something frightened him. He became colder. Over the following days, he avoided the infirmary entirely. When Wren passed him in the halls, he offered nothing but brief nods. His expression locked back into its familiar stillness. When she tried to speak to him once in the courtyard, he gave short, clipped answers and excused himself before she could finish her sentence. Wren was not the type to be easily discouraged, but she was not foolish either. She noticed the shift immediately, and it stung more than she expected. She told herself it didn't matter. He was an alpha king. She was a visiting healer. Their paths were never meant to cross beyond a temporary assignment. But the sting remained anyway, quiet and persistent, like a splinter she couldn't quite locate. 5 days after the incident in the infirmary, she finally confronted him. She found him alone on the eastern balcony, looking out over the training grounds below, his hands braced against the stone railing. She didn't ask permission to approach. She simply walked up beside him and stood there until he acknowledged her. "You've been avoiding me," she said. "I've been busy." "You've been avoiding me," she repeated, "and I'd like to know why. Because 1 minute you're hovering in my doorway, and the next you can barely look at me." Kael's jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing, and Wren almost turned to leave, assuming she wouldn't get an answer. Then he spoke, quietly, his voice rougher than usual. 10 years ago, I lost my mate, Sarah. He kept his eyes on the training grounds, unable to look at her directly. She died the night we were meant to fully bond. My wolf has been silent ever since. Not angry, not grieving in any way I could manage. Just silent, gone quiet, like it decided feeling anything again wasn't worth the risk. Wren stayed still, listening, letting him continue without interruption. "Then you laughed," he said, "and it was like something inside me woke up that I thought had died with her. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know if I'm allowed to want it." "Allowed by who?" Wren asked gently. "By her memory. By the promise I made to never let anyone replace her." Wren considered this for a moment. her expression softening. "I don't think wanting something new means you're replacing what you lost," she said. "I think it just means you're still alive. Those aren't the same thing, even if grief tries to convince you they are." Kael finally turned to look at her, something unguarded flickering across his face for the first time in years. He didn't say anything else, not yet, but the silence between them no longer felt cold. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them was ready to name. Their fragile understanding didn't get the chance to settle quietly. Within the week, trouble arrived at the citadel gates in the form of an old threat Kael had thought long buried, remnants of the very conspiracy responsible for Sarah's death years earlier, resurfacing now with new purpose. Word reached him that they had set their sights on Wren, hoping to strike at the Alpha King through someone he had clearly grown to care for. The moment Kael learned of the threat, something inside him shifted entirely. For 10 years, he had moved through life as a king, bound by duty alone, distant and controlled. Now, faced with the possibility of losing Wren the same way he'd lost Sarah, his wolf rose fully to the surface. Not in fear this time, but in fierce, focused readiness. He organized his guards with a clarity and urgency the citadel hadn't seen from him in years. When the threat finally arrived at the border, Kael fought not as a king performing his duty, but as a man and wolf, acting as one, fully present, fully alive, refusing to let history repeat itself. Wren, far from helpless, used her knowledge to treat the wounded and keep the citadel's defenses steady from within, proving herself just as essential to the outcome as anyone on the front line. By the time the danger passed, the conspiracy was finally dismantled for good, and the citadel exhaled with relief it had been holding for a decade. In the quiet days that followed, Kael visited Sarah's memorial for the first time in years. Not out of obligation, but because he finally felt ready to say goodbye properly, instead of staying frozen in the grief he'd carried for so long. He spoke softly to her memory, thanking her for the time they'd had, and allowing himself, finally, to let go of the guilt that had kept his wolf silent for so long. When he returned to the citadel, he found Wren waiting near the infirmary, unaware he'd come looking for her, simply going about her work as she always did. He approached her without hesitation this time, and for the first time in 10 years, something easy and warm crossed his face. He smiled. It wasn't a grand or dramatic moment, no fanfare, no audience beyond a few startled guards passing by. Just a quiet, genuine smile, the kind that reached his eyes and softened every hard line that had settled there over the years. Wren noticed immediately, and her own face lit up in response, equal parts surprised and pleased. "There it is," she said softly. "Took you long enough." "I had some things to work through," he admitted. "I noticed." They stood there together, neither rushing to fill the silence, both simply enjoying the unfamiliar comfort of it. The Packs would talk for weeks about the day their Alpha King smiled again, wondering what could have possibly changed after 10 long years of silence. Few of them would ever know the full story, the laugh that cracked something open, the wolf that finally woke, and the quiet healer who never once tried to fix him, only stayed long enough for him to find his own way back.